They say your entire life can change in a single second. For Flora, that second wasn't when she won the lottery or met a prince. It was the moment she dropped a tray of champagne on the most dangerous man in New York City. Humiliated, fired, and on her knees, picking up jagged glass, she thought her life was over. She was wrong. It was just beginning. Because as she bent down, a hidden necklace slipped out from her uniform, a necklace that made a billionaire freeze in terrifying silence. What happens when a piece of cheap jewelry turns out to be the key to a 20-year-old murder mystery? You won't believe the twist coming up. This is the story of the Waitress and the sterling secret. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean, it just made the grime slicker. Flora Bennett adjusted the strap of her messenger bag, wincing as the worn leather dug into her shoulder. She checked her watch, a scratched Casio she'd bought at a pawn shop for $5. 4:52 p.m. She was going to be late for the dinner shift at Le Ciel, and Gregory, the floor manager, was looking for any excuse to fire her. Flora wasn't just broke, she was drowning. At 24, she was working 2 jobs to pay for a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and to cover the medical bills for her foster mother, Martha, who was currently in hospice care. Martha was the only person who had ever treated Flora like a human being after she was found abandoned at a fire station as a toddler. Now, Martha was fading, and Flora was terrifyingly alone. She pushed through the heavy oak doors of Le Ciel, the blast of warm, expensive air hitting her wet face. The restaurant was a playground for the elite, tech moguls, oil tycoons, and politicians who spent more on a bottle of wine than Flora made in a year. "Bennett!" a voice snapped like a whip. Flora flinched, rushing toward the locker rooms. Gregory stood there, checking his reflection in a brass pillar. He was a short man who wore suits that were too tight, trying to project power he didn't have. "I'm here, Gregory. I'm sorry. The bus broke down on 4th Avenue. Flora breathless, pulling her hair back. "You're 4 minutes late," Gregory sneered, not looking at her. "You know the policy. 3 strikes. You're sitting on 2, Bennett. 1 more toe out of line, and you're back on the street. Now get changed. Table 4 is reserved for a VIP tonight, and if you mess this up, don't bother coming back." Flora nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, sir." Inside the locker room, Flora stripped off her soaked street clothes and pulled on the crisp black uniform. It was tight in the chest and loose in the waist, ill-fitting and uncomfortable. As she buttoned the collar, her fingers brushed against the cold metal resting against her sternum. She pulled it out for a second, a habit she did when she was nervous. It was a heavy, tarnished silver pendant, shaped like a shield with a crack running down the center. It looked like junk. 2 distinct animals were engraved on it, but time had worn them down to vague shapes. A lion? A wolf? She didn't know. It was the only thing found on her when she was abandoned. Martha had told her to sell it 1,000 times, saying the silver might fetch $50, but Flora couldn't do it. It was the only anchor she had to a past she didn't remember. "Please," she whispered to the pendant, kissing it quickly before tucking it back under her uniform. "Just let me get through tonight. I need the tips for Martha's meds." The dinner rush was brutal. The clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation created a wall of noise. Flora was a blur of motion, balancing trays, pouring water, and reciting specials. She was invisible. To these people, she wasn't a person with dreams or fears. She was a mechanism that delivered steak tartare. Around 8 p.m., the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The air grew tense. Conversations hushed. The heavy doors swung open, and he walked in. Harrison Sterling, even Flora, who couldn't afford a television, knew who he was. Harrison Sterling was the CEO of Sterling Heavy Industries. He was worth billions. He was also known as the Ice King of the Pacific Northwest. Rumor had it his wife had died under mysterious circumstances 20 years ago, and he had never smiled since. He was a tall, imposing figure with silver-streaked hair and eyes that looked like shattered steel. He was accompanied by 2 bodyguards and a younger man in a flashy suit, his nephew and business partner, Charles Sterling. "Table 4, Gregory hissed in Flora's ear, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Pour from the right. If you embarrass me, I will destroy you." Flora's hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, picked up the vintage bottle of Chateau Margaux, and walked toward the lion's den. Harrison Sterling didn't look at the menu. He sat with the stillness of a predator, staring out the window at the rain. "Uncle, you have to listen to the proposal," Charles was saying, his voice nasally and irritating. "The tech sector is booming. If we liquidate the shipping division, we can triple our stock value by Q3. Harrison didn't blink. "I built the shipping division with my bare hands, Charles. I'm not gutting my legacy so you can buy another yacht." "It's not about the yacht. It's about the future," Charles argued, reaching for his water glass. Flora approached the table. "Steady hands," she told herself. "Just pour the wine." "Good evening, gentlemen," she said softly. Her voice trembled slightly. Harrison didn't acknowledge her. Charles waved a hand dismissively. "Just pour it, and make sure it breathes." Flora moved to Harrison's right side. She uncorked the bottle expertly, the rich aroma of red wine filling the space between them. She began to pour. It happened in a split second. Charles, angry at his uncle's dismissal, slammed his hand on the table to emphasize a point. "You're living in the past, Harrison." The sudden jolt shook the table. The heavy silver pepper mill on the edge wobbled and tipped over, rolling directly under Flora's elbow, just as she was lifting the bottle. Her arm bumped the mill. She lost her grip. No. Time seemed to slow down. Flora watched in horror as the heavy glass bottle slipped from her fingers. It didn't just fall. It clipped the edge of Harrison Sterling's wine glass. Crash. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet restaurant. Red wine, thousands of dollars worth, exploded outward. It drenched the white tablecloth. It soaked Flora's apron. But worst of all, a dark, crimson stain began to spread rapidly across the chest of Harrison Sterling's bespoke grey suit. The entire restaurant went silent. The music seemed to stop. Every head turned toward table 4. Harrison sat motionless, red wine dripping from his lapel like blood. "You stupid girl!" Charles shrieked, jumping up and wiping a speck of wine from his own sleeve. "Do you have any idea who this is? That suit costs more than your life." Flora couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. I'm so sorry. The table shook. She grabbed a cloth napkin, her hands trembling violently, and instinctively reached out to dab Harrison's suit. "Don't touch him!" Gregory appeared out of nowhere, his face purple with rage. He shoved Flora backward. She stumbled, her heel catching on the wet floor. She went down hard. Her knees slammed into the marble, landing amidst the shards of broken glass. A sharp pain shot up her leg as a piece of crystal sliced her shin, but the adrenaline was so high she barely felt it. "Get out!" Gregory hissed, looming over her. "You are fired. Get out of my restaurant before I call the police for property damage." "Please," Flora begged, tears hot in her eyes. She was on her knees, humiliated, surrounded by the elite of the city who looked at her with disgust. "I need this job. It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning. Pay for it." Charles laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "You couldn't pay for the dry cleaning, let alone the wine. Get lost, trash." Flora looked up. Harrison Sterling hadn't moved. He hadn't yelled. He was just watching her with those cold, dead eyes. She had to leave. She had to get out before she started sobbing. Flora scrambled to stand up. As she did, the top button of her uniform, loose from wear, popped off. Her collar fell open. Gravity took over. The heavy silver pendant she kept hidden against her skin swung out. It dangled there, catching the dim light of the chandelier, the tarnished shield, the crack down the center. Flora reached to tuck it back in, shame burning her cheeks. "Stop!" The voice didn't come from Gregory. It didn't come from Charles. It came from Harrison Sterling. It was a roar that shook the walls. Harrison stood up so abruptly, his heavy oak chair crashed backward onto the floor. He ignored the wine soaking his clothes. He ignored his nephew. His eyes were locked on Flora's chest. He moved faster than an old man should. In 2 strides, he was standing over her. Flora flinched, terrifyingly expecting him to hit her. She squeezed her eyes shut. I'm sorry." But the blow never came. Instead, she felt a large, rough hand grab her wrist. It wasn't violent, but it was an iron grip. "Where?" Harrison's voice was a ragged whisper, unrecognizable from the commanding tone he had used earlier. "Where did you get that?" Flora opened her eyes. Harrison was staring at the pendant. His face had drained of all color. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. The necklace?" Flora stammered. It's mine. I've always had it." "Liar!" Charles stepped in. "She probably stole it from a customer. Call the cops, Uncle. She's a thief on top of being incompetent." "Shut up, Charles," Harrison bellowed, not breaking eye contact with Flora. His hand was shaking as he reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the tarnished silver. He didn't touch the metal. He reached for the clasp at the back of her neck. "Sir, you can't touch the staff!" Gregory tried to intervene, sensing a lawsuit. Harrison turned his head, and the look he gave the manager was so lethal that Gregory actually took a step back. "Another word," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "And I will buy this building tonight, just to burn it down with you inside." Gregory closed his mouth. Harrison turned back to Flora. The cruelty was gone from his eyes, replaced by a desperate, frantic confusion. "Child," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, let me see the back of it." Flora was too stunned to resist. She nodded slowly. Harrison turned the pendant over with trembling fingers. The back was tarnished black, covered in years of grime. To anyone else, it looked smooth. But Harrison knew where to look. He ran his thumb over the bottom right edge. He pressed down on a hidden, microscopic indentation. Click. A hidden compartment in the solid silver sprung open. It was a mechanism so fine, only a master jeweler would know it existed. Inside the tiny cavity lay a coiled lock of golden hair and a microscopic engraving. Harrison read the engraving. He let out a sound that wasn't human, a guttural sob of pure agony. "It's you," he whispered, tears instantly spilling from his steel eyes, mixing with the wine on his cheeks. "Dear God, it's you." The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence as the billionaire fell to his knees in the broken glass, right in front of the waitress, holding the pendant like it was the Holy Grail. "Who are you?" Flora whispered, fear mixing with a strange magnetic pull. Harrison looked up at her, and for the first time in 20 years, the ice in his eyes melted. "My name is Harrison Sterling," he choked out, "and that pendant, I made it with my own hands for my wife, Isabella, on the day she told me she was pregnant. It was on her neck the night she was murdered." He gripped Flora's hand, holding it to his forehead. "You aren't just a waitress, Flora. You are the daughter I buried 24 years ago." The silence in Le Ciel was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a catastrophe. Flora stared down at the man kneeling in the wine-soaked debris. The most powerful man in Seattle was weeping, clutching her hand as if she were a lifeline in a storm. "Daughter?" Flora repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She pulled her hand back, fear spiking in her chest. "No, you're confused. My name is Flora. I'm an orphan. I was left at Station 51 in the downtown district. I don't know you." Harrison slowly stood up. The vulnerability that had flashed across his face vanished, replaced by a steely resolve, though his eyes remained wet. He looked at her, not as a waitress, but as a miracle. "Station 51, Harrison murmured, a flicker of recognition lighting up his face. "That is 3 miles from the old Sterling estate. The night of the fire." He trailed off, his mind racing. "Uncle, this is insanity." Charles stepped forward, his face flushed with panic. He grabbed Harrison's arm. "Look at her. She's a waitress, a nobody. She probably bought that trinket at a flea market. Don't let your grief blind you. The media is going to have a field day if you have a breakdown in public." Harrison didn't even look at his nephew. He shrugged off Charles's hand with a shrug of his shoulder that conveyed pure contempt. "Gregory," Harrison said, his voice booming without being loud. The manager, who was currently cowering behind the host stand, squeaked, "Yes, Mr. Sterling." "Miss Bennett is leaving with me," Harrison stated. "She is no longer your employee. However, you will pay her severance. 1 year's salary, in cash, delivered to my office by tomorrow morning. If you fail to do this, I will ensure you never work in this city again." Gregory nodded frantically, looking like a bobblehead. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." Harrison turned back to Flora. He took off his wine-stained suit jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of expensive cologne and old money. "Please," Harrison said, his tone gentle, almost pleading. "I know this is terrifying. I know you think I'm mad. But come with me. Just for an hour. Let me explain. Let me prove it." Flora looked at the door. She could run. She could run back to her mildewy apartment and hide. But then she thought of the unpaid bills on her counter. She thought of Martha lying in the hospice bed, fading away, and she felt the weight of the silver pendant against her chest, the pendant this stranger knew the secret of. "I need to call my foster mother," Flora said, her voice small. "She's sick." "We will get her the best doctors in the world," Harrison promised immediately. "I give you my word." Flora looked into his eyes, shattered steel, just like the description. But she saw something else there, too. She saw her own eyes reflected back at her. "Okay," she whispered. They walked out of the restaurant together, leaving a stunned crowd in their wake. Charles followed them, his face a mask of fury, typing rapidly on his phone. Outside, a sleek black Maybach was waiting. The driver, a mountain of a man named Elias, opened the door. "To the manor, sir?" Elias asked, not batting an eye at the wine-stained girl. "Home, Elias," Harrison said. "We're going home." The drive was silent for a long time. The city lights blurred past the rain-streaked windows. Flora sat as far away from Harrison as possible, clutching her messenger bag. "I'm not crazy," Harrison said softly, breaking the silence. He was staring at his hands. "That pendant, it's the Sterling crest. But the crack down the middle? I did that on purpose. It represents the duality of our family, strength and sacrifice, and the lock of hair inside. It was Isabella's. My wife." Flora touched the pendant through the fabric of the jacket. "How did you know how to open it?" "Because I designed the lock," Harrison said. "It requires a specific pressure point. It's impossible to open by accident. In 20 years you never opened it, did you? No, Flora admitted. I thought it was just a scratch. Exactly. Harrison turned to her. You have her chin, and my nose. But your eyes, those are sterling eyes, grey like a winter storm. The car turned off the main highway and approached a massive iron gate. The gate swung open, revealing a winding driveway lined with ancient cedar trees. At the top of the hill stood Stirling Manor. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress of stone and glass, overlooking the ocean. As the car stopped, Flora felt a wave of nausea. This was too much. Too fast. Charles, Harrison said as they stepped out of the car. Call Dr. Evans. Have him come here immediately with a DNA kit. Charles, who had followed in his own sports car, slammed his door. You're serious? You're going to drag the family doctor out here for this charade? Do it, Harrison snapped, or you're out of the will. Charles paled. He pulled out his phone, his jaw tight. Fine. But when this comes back negative, don't say I didn't warn you. Harrison guided Flora into the grand foyer. It was breathtaking. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a grand staircase that looked like it belonged in a movie. But the house felt cold, empty. It felt like a museum, not a home. Come, Harrison said. There is something you need to see. He led her down a long hallway lined with paintings. He stopped in front of a massive portrait hanging above a fireplace in the library. Flora looked up and gasped. The woman in the painting was beautiful. She had long golden hair and a kind smile. She was wearing a blue velvet dress, but around her neck, painted in exquisite detail, was the silver pendant. The exact same pendant that was currently around Flora's neck. But that wasn't what made Flora's heart stop. It was the face. Aside from the hair color, Flora's was dark brown, while the woman's was gold. It was like looking in a mirror. The curve of the cheekbones, the shape of the lips. Isabella, Harrison whispered, standing beside her. She died 24 years ago. The night you disappeared. Flora reached up and touched her own face, her eyes darting back and forth between the portrait and her reflection in the glass covering the painting. The resemblance was undeniable. What happened to her? Flora asked, her voice trembling. Harrison's face darkened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She was murdered, he said, his voice flat and cold. And for 24 years, I thought you died with her. Dr. Evans was a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses who smelled of antiseptic. He set up his equipment on the mahogany coffee table in the library, looking nervous. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Harrison sat in a leather armchair, watching every move. Charles paced by the window, pouring himself a scotch, his eyes darting toward Flora with open hostility. Just a simple cheek swab, miss, Dr. Evans said gently. Flora opened her mouth, letting him swab the inside of her cheek. She felt like a specimen in a jar. And you, Mr. Stirling, Dr. Evans said. Harrison submitted to the swab without blinking. I have the rapid analyzer in my bag, Dr. Evans said. New tech. We'll have the results in 45 minutes. 45 minutes, Harrison repeated. He looked at Flora. Are you hungry? Thirsty? I want to know the truth, Flora said, finding her courage. You said she was murdered. You said I died. How is that possible? Harrison took a deep breath. He poured a glass of water and placed it in front of her. 24 years ago, Harrison began, staring into the fire. I wasn't just a businessman. I was developing a new energy prototype, something that threatened the oil industry. I had enemies. Powerful ones. He paused, his hands clenching the armrests of his chair. We lived in the old estate, closer to the city. It was a stormy night, much like tonight. I was away in Tokyo for a conference. Isabella was home alone with our 6-month-old daughter, Clara. Clara. Flora tested the name in her mind. It sounded foreign. I got the call at 3:00 a.m., Harrison continued, his voice cracking. A fire. Not just a fire, an explosion. By the time I landed in Seattle, the house was a crater. The forensic team. They found Isabella's body in the nursery. She had been shot before the fire started. Flora gasped, covering her mouth. And the baby? She whispered. Harrison closed his eyes, a tear escaping. They found remains in the crib. Small bones. Ash. The coroner said the heat was so intense there was almost nothing left. We buried them together. I spent the next decade hunting the men who did it. I destroyed them. I bankrupted their companies. I put them in prison. But it didn't bring my family back. But if they found a body, Flora said, confused. They found a body, Harrison corrected, or what they thought was one. DNA testing back then wasn't what it is now, especially on burned remains. We just assumed. Who else would be in the crib? He looked at Flora intensely. But if you are here, then that means someone took you, someone swapped you, or someone saved you. Station 51, Flora said, piecing it together. The firefighters found me in a basket on their doorstep at 4 a.m. It was raining. I was wrapped in a blue blanket. Harrison's eyes widened. Isabella's favorite color. She knitted a blue blanket for Clara. Charles scoffed from the window, ice clinking in his glass. This is a fairy tale, Uncle. A coincidental basket, a lucky pendant. It's a con. She probably researched the fire. Shut up, Charles, Harrison roared, standing up. Look at her face. Look at the pendant. I am looking, Charles shot back. I see a girl who wants a payout, and I see an old man desperate for a ghost. Before Harrison could respond, a soft beep emitted from the machine on the table. The room went dead silent. Dr. Evans adjusted his glasses and looked at the small screen. He tapped a few keys. He frowned, then tapped again. He looked up, his face pale. Well? Charles demanded, stepping forward. Tell him. Tell him it's 0% so we can throw her out. Dr. Evans looked at Harrison. Then he looked at Flora. He took off his glasses and wiped them on his tie. Mr. Sterling, the doctor said, his voice shaking, the probability of paternity is 99.99998%. Charles dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, whiskey splashing onto the Persian rug. Harrison let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 2 decades. He collapsed back into his chair, covering his face with his hands, sobbing openly. It's true, Dr. Evans said. She is Clara Sterling. Flora sat frozen. It was real. The poverty, the struggle, the feeling of not belonging. It all made sense. She wasn't unwanted trash. She was a stolen heiress. But while Harrison wept with joy, Flora saw something else. She was looking at Charles. Charles wasn't looking at the doctor anymore. He was looking at his phone. He typed a short message, his face pale but his eyes hard and vicious. He hit send, then looked up and caught Flora watching him. For a second, the mask slipped. Flora saw pure, unadulterated hatred and fear. He shoved his phone into his pocket and forced a smile that looked like a grimace. Well, Charles said, his voice tight. This is unexpected. Welcome to the family, cousin. Harrison stood up and walked over to Flora. He didn't hug her this time. He knelt before her chair, treating her like royalty. Clara, he said softly, I have so much to make up to you. You will never work again. You will never suffer again. Everything I have is yours. I need to process this, Flora said, her head spinning. Can I just use the restroom? Of course, Harrison said. Top of the stairs, second door on the left. Flora stood up on shaky legs. She walked out of the library, feeling the eyes of the 3 men on her back. She climbed the grand staircase, her hand trailing on the velvet railing. She reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the bathroom, but as she passed a slightly ajar door, an office, she heard a voice. It was Charles. He must have slipped out the side door of the library to take a call. Flora froze. She knew she shouldn't listen, but something in his tone made her blood run cold. It's a disaster, Charles was hissing into the phone. The DNA matched. The old man knows. No, you don't understand. If she's alive, the trust fund reverts to her. I get nothing. Nothing. I don't care how you do it. Fix it. Finish what you started 24 years ago. Tonight. Flora stifled a gasp. She backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a sledgehammer. Finish what you started 24 years ago. Charles wasn't just a greedy nephew. He, or whoever he was talking to, was involved in the murder of her mother. And now they were coming for her. Flora turned to run back to Harrison, to warn him. But as she turned, she bumped into a hard chest. She looked up. Standing there, blocking her path to the stairs, was Elias, the driver, the mountain of a man who had driven them here. He wasn't smiling. Mr. Charles thought you might get lost, Elias said, his voice deep and menacing. Why don't you come with me, Miss Sterling? There's a nice view from the balcony. He reached out a massive hand to grab her. Flora didn't think. She reacted. She stomped on his foot with her heel and sprinted down the hallway, away from the stairs, away from Harrison, deeper into the dark, unknown mansion. "Secure the exits!" she heard Charles yell from the office. The hunt was on. Flora sprinted down the hallway, her breath tearing at her throat. The mansion, which had seemed so grand and beautiful only moments ago, now felt like a mausoleum. The shadows stretched long and distorted against the silk wallpaper, reaching for her. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from the stairs, away from Elias, and away from the library where Harrison sat, oblivious to the viper in the room. Her heels clicked loudly on the hardwood floor. Too loud. Without breaking stride, Flora kicked them off. She ran barefoot, the cold wood biting into her skin, but she was silent now. The years of working double shifts, navigating crowded dining rooms without making a sound, had given her a strange kind of grace. She wasn't an heiress trained in etiquette. She was a survivor, trained in invisibility. She reached a fork in the corridor. To the left, a gallery of windows overlooking the stormy sea. To the right, a darker, narrower hallway that looked like it led to the servants' quarters. She chose the right. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of Elias's boots. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He moved with the slow, confident gait of a predator that knew the prey had nowhere to go. "Come out, little girl," Elias called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Mr. Charles just wants to talk. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the painful way." Flora ducked into a laundry chute room, pressing her back against the door, her chest heaving. She locked it, her fingers trembling. It was a flimsy lock. One kick from a man that size would shatter it. She needed a weapon. She looked around. Baskets of linens, a heavy iron, bottles of bleach. She grabbed the bottle of bleach and uncapped it. It wasn't a gun, but it would blind him if he got too close. Suddenly, her pocket buzzed. It was the phone she had forgotten she had, her cheap, cracked smartphone. She pulled it out. No signal. The thick stone walls of the manor, or perhaps a jammer that Charles had activated, were blocking the network. She was alone. Flora sank to the floor, fighting back tears. "Think," she told herself. "Martha always said you were the smartest girl in the room. Think." She remembered the layout she had seen when they drove up. The manor was built on a cliff. The library was on the ground floor, west wing. She was currently on the second floor, east wing. To save Harrison, she had to circle back, but she couldn't go the way she came. She heard a crash down the hall. Elias was kicking open doors, checking rooms one by one. Crash. Closer. Crash. Next door. Flora scrambled to the window. It was locked. She undid the latch and pushed. The wind howled, blasting rain into the room, soaking her instantly. Below her, a steep slate roof sloped down toward a balcony, the balcony of the master suite, likely Harrison's room. It was a 20-foot drop if she slipped. Death was certain. The doorknob to the laundry room rattled. Then a heavy shoulder slammed into it. The wood splintered. "Found you," Elias grunted from the other side. Flora didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the sill, the bleach bottle tucked into her waistband, and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly ripped her off the ledge. The rain was freezing, blinding her. She clung to the wet stone molding of the window, her bare feet slipping on the slick slate tiles. Inside the room, the door exploded inward. Elias burst in, gun drawn, a silencer screwed onto the barrel. He looked around the empty room, confused. Then he saw the open window and the rain pouring in. He rushed to the window and looked out. Flora flattened herself against the darkness of the wall, just inches to his left, praying the shadows would hold her. Elias leaned out, scanning the roof below. "Damn it," he cursed into his headset. "She's on the roof. I'm going to the balcony to cut her off." He pulled his head back in and ran out of the room. Flora exhaled, a sob escaping her lips. She began to inch her way across the slate, moving sideways like a crab. Every step was a gamble. The wind whipped her hair into her eyes, stinging like whips. She reached the balcony of the master suite and dropped down, landing hard on the concrete. She rolled to absorb the impact, gasping as pain shot through her bruised ribs. She was in Harrison's bedroom. The glass doors were unlocked. She slipped inside, shivering uncontrollably. The room was massive, smelling of cedar and sorrow. On the nightstand, next to a bottle of sleeping pills, was a framed photograph of Isabella holding a baby. Flora paused for a second, touching the glass. "Mum," she thought. "I'm going to save him, I promise." She needed to get downstairs. But as she moved toward the bedroom door, she heard voices coming from the ventilation grate on the floor. The vents in these old houses carried sound perfectly. She knelt down, pressing her ear to the metal grate. It led directly to the library below. "Hysterical, Uncle." Charles's voice drifted up, smooth and lying. The shock was too much. She said she couldn't handle the pressure. She ran out the back door before I could stop her. Elias is out looking for her now. "No." Harrison's voice sounded weak, confused. She wouldn't just leave. She asked for water. She had Isabella's eyes. "She's a con artist, Harrison," Charles said, his voice hardening. "Or maybe she just cracked. Either way, she's gone. And honestly, it's for the best. You're not well. The doctor said the excitement is bad for your heart." "My heart is fine," Harrison snapped, though he sounded breathless. "I'm going to find her." "You're not going anywhere." There was a distinct sound of a click. Flora knew that sound from the movies. It was the safety of a gun being clicked off. "Sit down, Harrison," Charles said, his tone dropping all pretense of respect. "Sign the transfer papers. Now, or the girl dies." Flora's blood ran cold. He wasn't just going to kill her. He was using her as leverage first. She stood up. She couldn't hide anymore. She had to become the predator. She looked around the room for a weapon. A lamp? Too light? A statue? Too heavy? Her eyes landed on a display case on the wall. Inside, mounted on red velvet, was an antique cavalry saber, a relic from the Sterling ancestors. Flora smashed the glass with her elbow, ignoring the cut on her arm. She grabbed the hilt of the sword. It was heavy, lethal, and sharp. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a Sterling, and she was coming for them. Flora moved through the dark hallways of the second floor, the heavy sword dragging slightly in her grip. She was wet, bleeding, and barefoot, looking more like a vengeful spirit than a human being. She reached the top of the grand staircase. Below, the foyer was empty. The library doors were closed. She started to descend, keeping low. Suddenly, a massive hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Flora thrashed, swinging the sword wildly, but the grip was iron. She was lifted off her feet and dragged backward into the shadows of the upstairs landing. "Quiet!" a voice hissed in her ear. It wasn't Elias. The voice was terrified. The hand released her. Flora spun around, sword raised, ready to strike. It was Gregory, the manager from the restaurant. Flora lowered the sword, her jaw dropping. "Gregory, what are you doing here?" Gregory was trembling, soaking wet in his cheap suit. He held a manila envelope to his chest like a shield. I brought the money," Gregory stammered, eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Sterling said to bring the cash severance by morning, or he'd ruin me. I was terrified. I drove straight here. The gate was open. I walked in. I saw the gun." "You saw Charles," Flora whispered. "I saw the big guy, Elias," Gregory whispered back. "He was in the kitchen, loading a syringe. He was talking on the phone. He said, make it look like a heart attack. The old man dies tonight. The girl disappears at sea." Gregory looked like he was about to vomit. "I just wanted to drop off the money. I didn't sign up for murder. I have a cat." Flora grabbed Gregory's shoulders. "Gregory, listen to me. You have a car?" "Yes, out front." "I need you to do something very brave," Flora said intensely. "I need you to drive to the bottom of the hill and call the police. Tell them Harrison Sterling is being held hostage. Tell them to bring SWAT." I can't." "Yes, you can," Flora hissed. "You treated me like dirt for 2 years, Gregory. You owe me. If you leave now and don't help, I swear if I survive, I will own this city, and I will make sure you never work again. But if you help me, I'll make you the manager of Le Ciel. I'll give you the restaurant." Gregory blinked. Greed warred with cowardice in his eyes. Greed won. "Okay," he squeaked. "Okay, I'm going." "Go." Quietly. Gregory crept toward the front door. Flora waited until he slipped out. Then she turned her attention back to the library. She had to buy time until the police arrived. She crept down the stairs. The double doors of the library were thick oak. She couldn't just burst in. Charles had a gun. She needed a distraction. She looked at the foyer. A massive crystal chandelier hung above the center of the room. The winch control was a small brass panel on the wall near the library doors. Flora crept over to the panel. She unlocked the brake. Whir! The winch began to spin. The massive chandelier dropped 6 inches with a loud clank. Inside the library, voices stopped. "What was that?" Charles's voice. "Elias," Harrison asked. "Stay here," Charles ordered. Flora gripped the sword and hid behind a heavy velvet curtain near the entrance to the dining room, just 10 feet from the library doors. The library doors opened. Charles stepped out, the gun in his hand. He looked agitated. "Elias? Did you catch her?" Silence. The house creaked. Charles stepped further into the foyer, looking up at the chandelier. "What the hell?" Flora saw her chance. She didn't attack Charles. He had a gun. She attacked his mind. "Charles," she whispered from the shadows. Her voice was low, mimicking the tone of a ghost. Charles spun around, aiming the gun blindly at the empty staircase. "Who's there? Flora, come out!" "You missed one," Flora whispered, moving behind a pillar. 24 years ago. You missed." "Show yourself!" Charles screamed, his composure cracking. He fired a shot into the darkness. Bang! The sound was deafening. A vase shattered. "Charles!" Harrison yelled from inside the library. Charles backed up toward the library doors. "Elias, get down here!" "Elias can't hear you," Flora said, stepping out from behind the curtain. She stood in the dim light of the foyer, wet hair plastered to her face, the cavalry sword gleaming in her hand. She looked terrifying. Charles's eyes widened. He laughed nervously. "A sword? You brought a sword to a gunfight? You really are stupid, cousin." He raised the gun, aiming directly at her chest. "Drop it," Charles sneered, "or I put a bullet in you right now." Flora didn't drop it. She tightened her grip. "Shoot me and the police will hear it. They're already on their way." "You're lying," Charles said, but his eyes darted to the window. "No one is coming. This creates a problem, though. I was going to make it look like an accident. Now, I guess it has to be a tragic break-in. Robbers killed the family. A tragedy." He steadied his aim. Suddenly, the front door burst open behind Flora. But it wasn't the police. It was Elias. He had come back in from the garden. Flora was trapped. Charles in front of her with a gun. Elias behind her with his bare hands. "Grab her!" Charles ordered. Elias lunged. Flora swung the sword backward blindly. The blade sliced through the air and connected. It didn't hit Elias deeply, but the tip slashed across his forearm. Elias roared in pain and backhanded Flora. The blow sent her flying across the marble floor. The sword skittered away, sliding under a table. Flora crashed into the wall, her vision swimming. She tasted blood. Elias loomed over her, clutching his bleeding arm. "You little witch!" Charles walked over, holstering his gun, looking down at her with disgust. "Finish it, Elias. Then we do the old man. We'll burn the house down again. It worked 20 years ago. It'll work today." Elias reached down, wrapping his massive hands around Flora's throat. Flora clawed at his hands, kicking, but he was too strong. Black spots began to dance in her vision. The world was fading. "I failed," she thought. "I'm sorry, Martha. I'm sorry, Dad." "Hey!" The voice was thunderous. Everyone froze. Standing in the doorway of the library, leaning heavily against the frame, was Harrison Sterling. He was pale, clutching his left arm, his chest heaving. But in his right hand he held a flare gun, taken from the maritime display in the library. "Get your hands off my daughter," Harrison growled, his voice vibrating with a rage that shook the floorboards. "Uncle," Charles said, turning slowly, unbothered. "Put that toy away. You're having a heart attack. Just lie down and die." "I said—" Harrison raised the flare gun, aiming not at Charles, but at the massive tapestry hanging on the wall behind them, a tapestry that was centuries old and dry as tinder. "Let her go." "He won't shoot," Charles told Elias. "He loves this house too much." Harrison didn't blink. He pulled the trigger. Whoosh! The flare exploded into the tapestry. Instantly, a wall of fire roared up the side of the foyer. The heat was intense and immediate. The fire alarm began to blare. A piercing shriek. "You crazy old fool!" Charles screamed, shielding his face from the heat. Elias, distracted by the sudden inferno, loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. That was all Flora needed. She jammed her thumbs into Elias's eyes. He screamed, releasing her and stumbling back, Blinded, Flora scrambled away on all fours, coughing in the smoke. "Kill them!" Charles shrieked, pulling his gun again. "Kill them both!" But the fire was spreading fast. The varnish on the wood paneling was igniting. The foyer was becoming an oven. Flora crawled toward Harrison. He had slumped to the floor, the flare gun dropping from his hand. The exertion had been too much. "Dad!" Flora screamed, reaching him. She grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. "We have to move. Come on." "Go." Harrison wheezed, his face grey. "Save yourself, Clara. I'll hold them off." "No!" Flora yelled, dragging the billionaire across the library floor. "I just found you. I am not losing you." A bullet splintered the doorframe next to her head. Charles was firing through the smoke. Flora dragged Harrison behind the heavy oak desk. "Where is the back exit?" Flora demanded, shaking him. "Bookshelf," Harrison gasped, pointing to the wall of books. "The red volume." Flora scrambled up. She scanned the shelves. Red volume. Red volume. There were hundreds. "History of Maritime Law," Harrison whispered. Flora found it. She yanked the book. The bookcase clicked and swung inward, revealing a dark stone passage. A panic room entrance. "Get in!" Flora shoved Harrison into the darkness. She turned to follow, but a hand grabbed her ankle. Charles. He had crawled through the smoke, his face twisted in a demonic mask of soot and rage. "You're not getting my money!" he screamed, dragging her back out. Flora kicked him in the face, but he didn't let go. He was fueled by 20 years of waiting. He leveled the gun at her face. "Goodbye, Clara." Flora squeezed her eyes shut. Click. The gun jammed. Or maybe it was empty. Charles stared at the gun in shock. Flora didn't waste the miracle. She grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from the desk, a solid globe, and swung it with both hands. Crack! It connected with Charles's temple. He crumpled instantly, unconscious, his hand releasing her ankle. Flora scrambled into the secret passage and slammed the bookcase shut, locking it from the inside, just as the fire in the foyer roared to a crescendo, consuming the sterling legacy. She was in the dark, but she was alive, and she had her father. The secret passage was a suffocating throat of stone, damp and smelling of centuries of decay, a jarring contrast to the inferno raging just feet above their heads. Flora's lungs burned with smoke as she half-dragged Harrison Sterling through the dark. The billionaire was dead weight, his breathing a terrifying, ragged rattle. "Stay with me," Flora grunted, stumbling over a root. "You didn't survive 20 years of grief just to die in a tunnel. Fight, Harrison!" They burst out onto a narrow, rocky ledge halfway down the cliff face. The wind from the ocean whipped them, mixing rain with ash that fell like black snow. Above, the mansion groaned. With a sound like a thunderclap, the roof collapsed. A pillar of sparks shot into the sky, signaling the end of the Sterling legacy. "Help!" Flora screamed, though the crashing waves swallowed her voice. Suddenly, beams of light cut through the gloom from the beach below. The Coast Guard, but scrambling ahead of them, slipping on wet rocks in cheap dress shoes, was a familiar figure. Gregory. "Flora!" the manager yelled, his face pale with terror. He threw his jacket over Harrison. "I called them. Is he alive?" "He's having a heart attack," Flora cried, as paramedics swarmed the ledge. "Don't let him die!" 3 days later, the private waiting room at New York Presbyterian Hospital was silent. Flora sat in a plastic chair, staring at her scrubbed raw hands. The door opened. Arthur J. Gold, New York's most feared litigator, entered. He looked grim. "It's bad, Clara," Gold said, sitting opposite her. "The police pulled Charles from the rubble. He survived. And he's talking." Flora felt a chill. "What is he saying?" "He claims you are a deranged stalker," Gold explained. "He says you seduced his senile uncle, broke into the house, and attacked him with a sword. He says you set the fire. He's lying. He confessed to murdering my mother. It's your word against a sterling executive, Gold warned. The manor is ash. The DNA test results burned in the library. And Dr. Evans, he died in a car accident yesterday. Brake failure. Flora collapsed back. They had cleaned house. No DNA, no witness, no recording. Even the pendant was useless now. The heat of the fire would have destroyed the biological sample inside. They are charging you with arson and attempted murder, Gold said softly. Suddenly, the ICU doors burst open. A nurse rushed out. "Mr. Gold, come quickly, he's awake!" They rushed in. Harrison looked frail, hooked to a dozen machines, but his steel-grey eyes were open. He looked at Flora, tears pooling, and pointed frantically at a notepad. Flora handed him a pen. With a trembling hand, he wrote 2 words. Zurich Cloud. "Cloud?" Flora asked. Harrison pulled his oxygen mask down. "The cameras aren't local. They stream to private servers. In Switzerland." Arthur Gold froze, then grinned. "The off-site backup. He has the footage." 1 month later, the courtroom was packed for the trial of the century. Charles Sterling, wrapped in bandages, sat at the defense table. He looked smug. His team had successfully painted Flora as a lunatic. "The prosecution rests," the DA announced. "But first, we submit Exhibit Z, obtained via diplomatic courier from Switzerland." The giant screens flickered to life. The footage was crystal clear. It showed the library, the DNA test, and the 99.9% match. Then the audio kicked in. "If she's alive, the trust fund reverts to her. Fix it. Finish what you started 24 years ago." The courtroom gasped. On screen, Charles's face was twisted in hate. In the room, the real Charles slumped forward, burying his head in his hands. Flora sat in the front row, holding Harrison's hand. As the verdict was read, "Guilty," Harrison whispered, "You have your mother's fire." 6 months later, Le Ciel reopened. The oppressive decor was gone, replaced by warm light. The new owner, Gregory, stood by the door in a tailored suit. Flora had kept her promise and gifted him the restaurant. At the best table, Flora, now legally Clara Sterling, sat with Harrison. They clinked glasses, toasting to the future. She had lost the only mother she knew, but she had found her father, her name, and her voice. And that is how a clumsy mistake with a bottle of wine toppled a corrupt empire. From a fired waitress to the heiress of a dynasty, Flora proved that the truth can only be buried for so long. Charles thought he could burn the evidence, but he forgot that in the digital age, nothing is ever truly gone. What did you think of the Zurich Cloud twist? Did you think Charles was going to win? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this saga, please hit that like button. It really supports the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more stories of justice and secrets. Thanks for watching.